Okay, today, everyone, today we are going to go a little bit of a step further into our actual render. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite figure out the resolution issue. I was working with it with a buddy of mine at work, and we couldn't figure it out together, but I will. I'll try my best this weekend. But anyway, what we're going to look at today is developing the environment for a little bit more believability. So we're going to add some water element to it, and we're going to look at using a natural physical sky and some of the settings that are going to help you get the sky effect that you want. If you're going to use a sky effect. If you're not going to use a standard gradient sky, then I would suggest something like just no background at all and then Photoshop it in, which we'll do later. But let's start with the basics of that physical sky that I was referring to. When you go into, remember you have location and time, right? So that's where you set your sun position. When you go into environment, this is where you start to actually develop everything that your model is sort of built within. So what we can do here is switch from constant dome, right? That's what we have already, and that's what made that sort of like blue sheen background that we had going on, to what's called physical sky. And you notice that these settings will all change. These settings are not exactly intuitive, right? So unless you already know the terminology, it's going to be hard for you to understand how it works. However, there is this really awesome resource called the Maxwell Render plugin manual. So this, believe it or not, is actually useful. So you know how like oftentimes the manuals for software, basically you can't learn anything from a manual because it's too disjointed, it doesn't make any sense. Well, this one actually brings you through every menu, every feature, every setting of every menu, and it tells you what it does. So this is what I've been using to learn the little bit of stuff that I've learned about it so far. But what we're going to do is go into the environment page right here, and you guys can pull it up on your screen if you want. I'm going to have it up here. Don't worry so much about it. Where's my scroll? There we go. Yeah, just Google Maxwell for Rhino manual. So down here, page 38. Yeah, search for I'll show you. Hang on. Maxwell for Rhino manual, and it's this one that's a PDF. Just go directly into that. Let's see. Will it keep my position? No, it will not. Okay, so this kind of tells you everything about the scene manager, and feel free to go through that on your own time, but the one that we're interested in right now is this one called Physical Sky Parameters. When you scroll down a little bit, and we're not going to deal with this stuff right here, but we are going to deal with some of the more basics that, sorry. We are going to deal with some of the physical basics. So it's some of the stuff that you would see in a natural environment, because Rhino deals with light and environment like the actual physical world, right? So it actually has, if you look up there, it actually accounts for where the sun is, any kinds of gases or aerosols, so those are things that we see every day, and so it has an effect on how we're rendering it. But the more direct, components of it are here. Sun temperature, power, planet reflectance, that's all kind of just really about the intensity of the light that's coming in. But there's this thing called turbidity, which I doubt any of you have heard that term before, or if you have, very few of you. But anyway, what it's going to do is define how clear or how congested your sky kind of is, and so that's what you see here. The turbidity is increasing the particulates in the air, right? So if you could think of it like not really smog, but almost like smog. And then so that's a big one that we're going to kind of play around with. The other one that we're going to look at, I'm not necessarily going to look at wavelength with you guys, but feel free to you know, play with it if you want. But scattering is something that we can look at and mess around with a little bit too. So, you know, generally speaking, don't worry too much about these, but turbidity, scattering, and if you want to mess around with wavelength, go ahead. So let's get in there and actually see what it does to our render, and we're just going to do a brief render for it. So let's go into physical sky, and remember I mentioned turning down the power of the sun, right, to 0.9 because 1.0 was too much. Well, as you change the position of your sun, the time of day versus where your camera is, in some cases you may get more or less light. So you need to constantly be working with the power and the temperature maybe sometimes. So let's go into turbidity here, right? So when you go in the manual, it says that a turbidity of 0 is a perfectly clear sky. A turbidity right there of 0.3 is pretty congested. But the one that it defaulted to is 0.04. So if you think about it, 0 to 0.4 to something, you know, being the middle ground, and then something at 0.3, right? That's 0.2. That's 0.26 more than the 0.4, right? So it basically rises, you know, really fast, and then it kind of flatlines, and after that point, you're going to have a well-spread growth of aerosols in the air in order to make it work. So let's jump down to a 0.0 to get us started. 0.0. And then down here for scattering, it's up to you to define whether or not you want to increase or decrease it. But generally for most renders, if you have a high sun, less scattering, and if you don't have very many particulates in the air, less scattering is a little bit better. So let's go down to, I think we start at 0, or did it start us at 0.7? I think it started us at 0.7, right? Yeah, so the asymmetry is at 0.7. Let's go down to 0. Let's not go into the negatives yet, but 0 will probably, you know, kind of decrease the intensity in the sky. And so let's quickly do a draft render, and I'm going to let it run for probably just like 2 or 3 minutes before we go, before we discuss it. Pull this on the screen. All right, I'm going to pause the video here for a moment while that kind of drafts out. All right, so it's still drafting out, but you know, you can kind of already see what the effect is, right? It went from that, you know, sort of deep, I don't know, aqua green, gray thing that I had before using the constant dome to this, which has some actual substance to it, right? And you know, basically right at the horizon is the only part that is really showing any kind of particulates or any kind of reflectance of light because there's so much environment that you're looking through, right? That's something that you experience every day, you know, when you're on one of your on-ramps or off-ramps and you're looking down the freeway or something like that, right? So what we're going to do next, I'm going to save this image, and then I'm going to draft with a bit of an alternate, modifying the environment a little bit. Then I'm going to overlay them and just toggle them back and forth using Photoshop. It's a good way to kind of compare and contrast many different settings. So let me stop that. I'll save this image. No, not right now. I would suggest, I mean, we're going to have some time later to explore it, and I'm going to give you some parameters for settings to explore. I'll just go here and I'll call it Envir1.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, like, when you save the image, what's the difference between the 8 and the 16?
I honestly don't know yet.
Okay.
I don't know what the I don't know what that setting is. Was it BPP or BP or? It's probably 8-bit or 16-bit, but I don't. It could be color based, so most likely.
Is this something that you do?
I'm not the expert on that. Yeah, but generally higher numbers it means a higher file size and higher quality. All right, so the other thing I'm going to change here, the sun in that image was, basically reflecting down on the horizon. I'm going to start to look at some of these other features. So I'm going to increase the turbidity and look at something that's a little bit more intense. So let's go all the way up to that maximum range of 0.3. And with the asymmetry, let's start to increase the asymmetry back up to 0.7, which should give us a more kind of glowy horizon, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Even though that one has a sun in it, it should still give us the same kind of effect. So let's run a quick draft of that. Don't know why this keeps going on my other screen. And I'll pause just for a moment while that's running.
So the 0.3 is
Okay, so real quick, that is kind of basically the result that we're getting is that now the sky is much more, the light in it is much more diffuse, which means it's reflecting in many different ways, and so therefore more light is filling up the sky via illuminating particulates and aerosols and stuff like that. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do real quick is just stop this, save it, and let's go here. Disgusting. Yeah, you could. I don't know where the color setting is though for it, so. Yeah, you do have to do some color changing. I do have a video to show you guys too of Maxwell's animation of a sea, which is really cool. So anyway, let me open one of those. So I'm going to open, go to Envir 2, and then I'll place Environment 1. So just with these two settings, you can see a huge, huge difference between these two images, right? One of them is far more saturated with color, and just by changing the quality of the air, this one gets far more flattened, right? So just understand that these settings are incredibly subtle, and so that kind of clarity can either be desirable, or in some cases you might actually want to flatten out your image a little bit more like this. Okay? All make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so what I would like you to do is get together I do want you to do some draft renders with this real fast. We'll just take like 15 minutes to throw out 2 of these. We're going to do some overlay kind of testing on this thing, and then I'm going to show you another feature where you can actually insert like a real sky. Well, not in the render, but in Photoshop.